places where ordinary people gather, doing ordinary things. But when respect collides with arrogance, when honor meets
Adding up and all
authority,
that.
and when
All
awareness
titles
goes in
reflecting
front of
Henry Trainer.
casualty, the ordinary becomes extraordinary. This is the story of such a moment. It happened in a crowded cafeteria on a Tuesday afternoon, where the sound of laughter would soon turn to stunned silence. Where five men thought they held all the power, until they discovered what real strength looks like. Joe, where a veteran carrying invisible scars would teach an unforgettable lesson about dignity, respect, and what it truly means to serve others. What began as cruel entertainment for some would become a masterclass in character for everyone watching. Because sometimes, the most powerful battles aren't fought on distant shores or foreign soil. Sometimes, they happen right in front of us, in the spaces we share every day, when someone decides that enough is enough. The cafeteria erupted in giggles that day. But by the time the story ended, no one was laughing anymore. Marcus Thompson had seen better days, but he carried himself with the quiet dignity that comes from surviving things most people never have to face. At 62, his hair had turned silver, and lines mapped the weathered landscape of his face like rivers carved by time and experience. His left hand bore a slight tremor, a reminder of the roadside bomb that had changed everything 15 years ago in Afghanistan. But his eyes remained sharp, alert, missing nothing. The downtown corporate cafeteria buzzed with its usual Tuesday afternoon energy. Office workers in crisp shirts and polished shoes moved through the lunch line, their conversations a mixture of business deals, weekend plans, and office gossip. The space itself was modern and bright, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flooded the room with natural light, reflecting off the polished steel serving counters and contemporary furniture. Marcus had been working the maintenance crew for 3 months now. It wasn't the job he'd dreamed of when he returned from his third deployment, but it paid the bills and kept him busy. The work was honest, and that mattered to him. He moved quietly through the dining area, emptying trash bins and wiping down tables with methodical precision. Most people didn't notice him, which was exactly how he preferred it. Invisibility had become his armor against a world that often didn't know what to do with broken soldiers. At table 7, near the large windows overlooking the city street, 5 men in expensive suits had claimed their territory for lunch. They worked for Hartwell & Associates, one of the building's premium tenant companies, and they wore their success like cologne, obvious and overwhelming. Brad Hartwell Jr., the founder's nephew, sat at the head of their informal circle. At 28, he possessed the kind of confidence that came from never facing real consequences. His colleagues, Mark, David, Tony, and Steve, formed his usual entourage, always ready with laughter for his jokes and agreement for his opinions. The conversation at their table had started innocently enough, discussing quarterly projections and client presentations. But as often happened when these 5 gathered, the topic gradually shifted toward entertainment at others' expense. It was Mark who first noticed Marcus struggling with a particularly heavy trash bin near the serving area.
"Look at that guy," Mark whispered, nodding in Marcus's direction.
"Think he's had a few too many this morning?" The observation drew the attention of the others. Marcus was indeed moving more slowly than usual, his left hand shaking as he gripped the bin. The medication he took for nerve damage sometimes made simple tasks more challenging, but he pressed on, determined to finish his work without making a scene. Brad leaned back in his chair, a smirk playing across his features. "Probably one of those homeless vets they hire out of pity," he said, his voice carrying just enough volume to be heard by nearby tables. "City's full of them now. Can't hold a real job, so they stick them in maintenance." The comment earned chuckles from his companions. David, emboldened by the group's response, added his own observation.
"My dad always said military guys were just glorified janitors anyway."
Clean up messes, follow orders, can't think for themselves. Marcus heard the words, but he'd heard worse. 22 years of military service had taught him when to fight and when to walk away. This felt like a walking away moment. He finished emptying the bin and moved to the next table, hoping the conversation would shift to something else. But Tony was just getting started. He pulled out his phone and began filming in Marcus's direction. "This is perfect content right here," he said, loud enough for Marcus to hear. "Watch this guy try to figure out how to work a simple trash bag." The cruelty in his voice made several nearby diners shift uncomfortably in their seats. A woman at the adjacent table frowned and whispered something to her companion. A businessman eating alone glanced up from his newspaper with obvious disapproval. But the 5 men at table 7 seemed oblivious to the growing tension around them. Marcus paused at a table 2 spots away from theirs, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. His military training screamed at him to maintain situational awareness. to recognize when a situation was escalating beyond simple rudeness. The filming crossed a line, but he'd learned to pick his battles carefully. His job hung in the balance, and at his age, finding another one wouldn't be easy. Steve, perhaps sensing that Marcus was listening, decided to amp up the performance. He stood up dramatically and began mimicking Marcus's slightly unsteady movements, exaggerating the tremor in his hand. "Hey, look at me. I'm a war hero," he said in a mocking voice. "Give me special treatment because I couldn't hack it in a real war." The laughter that erupted from their table was sharp and cruel, cutting through the normal cafeteria noise like a knife. Several conversations at nearby tables stopped entirely as people turned to see what was happening. The woman who had been frowning earlier pulled out her own phone, but not to join in the mockery. She was documenting what she hoped would serve as evidence if things went too far.
Marcus felt heat rising in his chest, but he forced himself to breathe steadily.
In Afghanistan, he'd learned to control his emotions under far worse circumstances than this. He'd held dying soldiers in his arms, made life-and-death decisions in split seconds, led men through hell and brought most of them home. 5 corporate bullies didn't compare to Taliban fighters or roadside bombs, but they were testing him in a way that felt deeply personal. Brad, feeding off his friend's energy, decided to escalate further. He walked over to Marcus, who was now wiping down a table with deliberate focus. "Excuse me," Brad said in a falsely polite voice. "My friends and I were wondering, when you were overseas, did they teach you any actual skills, or just how to clean things?" Marcus looked up slowly, meeting Brad's eyes for the first time. The younger man expected to see anger, frustration, maybe even fear. Instead, he found something much more unsettling: perfect calm. Marcus's gaze was steady, measuring as if he were calculating distances and angles. It was the look of someone who had faced real danger and survived. "I learned quite a bit," Marcus said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of experience. "But mostly, I learned about respect." Brad felt a flicker of something, not quite fear, but awareness that this interaction wasn't going exactly as he'd planned. The older man's presence suddenly seemed larger, more substantial. But with his friends watching and recording, backing down wasn't an option. Respect? Brad laughed, but it sounded forced now. That's rich, coming from someone whose biggest accomplishment is learning to empty trash cans without dropping them. The insult hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Around them, the cafeteria had grown noticeably quieter. People were paying attention now, some discreetly recording with their phones, others simply watching with growing unease. The serving staff behind the counter had stopped their work entirely, sensing that something significant was unfolding. Marcus straightened slowly, setting down his cleaning cloth with careful precision. When he spoke again, his voice was even quieter than before. But somehow it carried to every corner of the room. "Son," he said, and the word carried 20 years of authority, "you might want to rethink your approach here." The simple statement hit Brad like a physical force. There was something in the way Marcus said "son" that made it clear this wasn't a man to be trifled with. But pride and peer pressure are powerful forces, and Brad had built his entire identity around never backing down, especially not in front of his colleagues. "Are you threatening me?" Brad asked, his voice rising slightly. "'Cause I've got witnesses here, old man. And last I checked, the customer is always right." Marcus smiled then, but it wasn't a friendly expression. It was the smile of someone who had heard similar words from much more dangerous people and lived to tell about it. "I'm not threatening anyone," he said. "I'm just suggesting that maybe you don't understand the situation you're in." The tension in the room was becoming palpable. Conversations at distant tables had stopped entirely. The woman with the phone was now openly recording, and several other diners had pulled out their devices as well. The serving staff had begun whispering among themselves, clearly uncertain about whether to intervene. Tony, still filming, decided to push things further. "Oh, this is getting good," he said loudly. "The janitor thinks he's tough. What are you going to do, old-timer? Mop us to death?" His friends burst into laughter again, but it was nervous laughter now. Something about Marcus's stillness, his complete lack of defensive posturing, was beginning to unsettle them. Most people, when confronted by a group, would either retreat or puff themselves up.
Marcus did neither.
He simply stood there, radiating a kind of quiet confidence that suggested he'd been in similar situations before and knew exactly how they ended. Mart, perhaps sensing that the mood was shifting, tried to dial back the aggression slightly. "Come on, Brad," he said. "Let's just eat our lunch. The guy's not worth it. But Brad was in too deep now. The attention of the entire cafeteria was on their table, and walking away would mean losing face in front of dozens of potential witnesses. In his mind, he was the successful businessman, the paying customer, the one with power in this situation. The maintenance worker was just an obstacle to be moved aside. "You know what I think?" Brad said, taking a step closer to Marcus. "I think you're all talk. I think you're just another washed-up vet who can't handle the real world. Probably couldn't even handle the fake war they sent you to." The words hit Marcus like a physical blow, but not in the way Brad intended. Instead of anger, they triggered something deeper, a profound sadness for the kind of person who could speak so casually about sacrifices they couldn't begin to understand. Marcus thought about his friends who hadn't come home, about the young soldiers who died in his arms, about the families left behind. He thought about the weight of decisions made in impossible circumstances, about courage displayed in moments when the whole world was falling apart. And he thought about respect back, not just the respect these young men were failing to show him, but the respect owed to everyone who served, everyone who sacrificed, everyone who put themselves in harm's way so others could sit in comfortable cafeterias and mock things they'd never experienced. The room fell completely silent now. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work. Everyone present seemed to sense that they were witnessing something significant, though none of them yet understood exactly what. Marcus took a deep breath, and when he spoke again, his voice carried the quiet authority of someone who had commanded men in combat, someone who had made life-and-death decisions, and lived with the consequences.
"I can see we need to have a different kind of conversation," he said simply.
And in that moment, everything changed. The transformation in Marcus was subtle but unmistakable. His posture shifted almost imperceptibly, his shoulders squaring in a way that spoke of parade grounds and morning inspections. The tremor in his left hand stilled completely, as if controlled by sheer force of will. Most striking was the change in his eyes. They became sharper, more focused, carrying the weight of command that had once directed Marines through the chaos of urban warfare. Brad felt the shift immediately, though he couldn't quite name what had changed. The maintenance worker was still there, but somehow he seemed bigger, more substantial. The easy target had vanished, replaced by something that triggered ancient survival instincts buried deep in Brad's privileged brain. "You gentlemen seem to have some misconceptions," Marcus said, his voice carrying a new edge of authority. "About service, about sacrifice, and about respect. I think it's time someone helped clarify things for you." Tony, still filming, tried to maintain his bravado. "Oh, look out, everyone. Grandpa's getting serious." "What are you going to do, bore us with war stories?"
Marcus turned his attention to Tony, and the younger man immediately felt the intensity of that gaze. It was like being examined under a microscope by someone who had seen too much, learned too much, and remembered everything.
"What's your name, son?" Marcus asked quietly. Tony hesitated, suddenly uncertain. "Tony. Tony Martinez." "Tony Martinez," Marcus repeated, as if filing the information away. "And what do you do for work, Tony?" "I'm in sales," Tony answered, though he wasn't sure why he was responding. Something about Marcus's tone made evasion feel impossible. "Sales?" Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "Good, honest work. Your parents proud of you?" The question caught Tony off guard. Yeah, I guess." "They should be," Marcus said with apparent sincerity. "Making an honest living, contributing to society. That matters." He paused, letting the words settle. "Tell me, Tony, do you think your parents would be proud of you right now? Filming a stranger trying to do his job, making fun of someone's disability?"
The directness of the question hit Tony like cold water.
Around the cafeteria, people were watching intently, many now openly recording the interaction. Tony glanced at his phone, still filming, and for the first time wondered what exactly he was capturing. "I'm not making fun of anyone's disability," Tony protested weakly. Marcus's expression didn't change. "You've been mimicking my hand tremor for the past 10 minutes. That tremor comes from nerve damage I sustained when an IED exploded near my convoy outside Kandahar.
I've been in there for...
3 Marines died that day. I lived, but with some reminders." He held up his left hand, letting the slight shake be visible. "So when you imitate this, you're not just mocking me. You're mocking their sacrifice, too." The color drained from Tony's face. His phone, suddenly feeling heavy in his hands, dropped to his side. Around the cafeteria, the silence had become absolute. Even the ventilation system seemed to have stopped humming. Marcus turned his attention to Steve, who had been the one mimicking his movements earlier. "And you, son, what's your name?" "Steve," came the barely audible response.
Steve Carson. Steve Carson.
You did a pretty good impression of me a few minutes ago. Very entertaining. Tell me, Steve, have you ever held a dying 19-year-old kid in your arms? Felt his blood on your hands while you tried to stop the bleeding? Looked into his eyes as he asked you to tell his mother he loved her? Steve's mouth opened and closed soundlessly. The theatrical confidence that had carried him through his earlier performance had evaporated completely. This is the background of history, I think, because that's what this tremor represents. Marcus continued, his voice never rising but somehow filling the entire space. It represents the weight of moments when everything depends on your decisions, when other people's lives hang in the balance, when failure means someone's son doesn't come home. What would you say? We paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. Now, I'm sure you thought you were being funny, 5 successful guys having a laugh at the expense of the maintenance worker. I get it. Sometimes we need to feel superior to others to feel good about ourselves. But here's what you don't understand. Service isn't about superiority. It's about putting others first, even when it costs you everything. David, who had earlier made the comment about military personnel being glorified janitors, found himself squirming under Marcus's steady gaze. When those eyes turned to him, he felt as if his very soul was being examined.
David Henderson, Marcus said, somehow knowing his name, though they'd never been introduced. You mentioned your father's opinion of military service. David nodded mutely, wondering how this man could possibly know his name.
Your father served in Vietnam, Marcus continued matter-of-factly.
Marine Corps, 1968 to 1970.
Came home to protest and people calling him a baby killer. Never talked about his service because he was ashamed of how the country treated him. Started telling people that military service was worthless because it was easier than admitting how much it hurt to be rejected by the very people he'd fought to protect.
David's face went white. David's face went white.
How do you know that? Marcus's expression softened slightly. Because I know the look, son. I've seen it in too many fathers who came home to a country that didn't want to hear their stories. Your dad wasn't telling you the truth about military service. Don't make it seem like you will deal death. He was protecting himself from old wounds. The revelation hit David like a physical blow. His father's bitterness about anything military-related suddenly made sense in a way that made his stomach churn with guilt and understanding. You want to know what your father really did? Marcus asked gently.
He spent 2 years in hell protecting the guy next to him, just like every other soldier in every other war. He came home changed because you can't see what he saw and remain the same.
And instead of getting help processing what he'd been through, he got spit on by protesters who had never left their college campuses. Mark, sensing the tide turning dramatically against them, tried to regain control of the situation. Look, this is all very touching, but we were just having some fun. No need to get all dramatic about it. Marcus turned to Mark with the same measured attention he'd given the others. Mark Williams, MBA from Northwestern. Never served a day in his life, but thinks he understands leadership because he manages a sales team. Mark's confidence faltered immediately. How do you know so much about us? Because I make it my business to know about the people I work around, Marcus replied. It's a habit from military service. We called it situational awareness, knowing your environment, understanding the players, recognizing threats and opportunities. He paused meaningfully. Right now, Mark, you're a threat. A threat? Mark laughed nervously. I'm just eating lunch. You're a threat to the basic decency this place depends on, Marcus clarified. You're a threat to the idea that people should be treated with respect regardless of their job or their circumstances. You're a threat to the younger employees who look up to you and learn from your example that it's okay to mock people who can't defend themselves.
Around the cafeteria, heads were nodding.
Several employees from various companies in the building were watching with obvious approval. A security guard had appeared at the entrance, but made no move to intervene, clearly recognizing that this wasn't a physical confrontation, but something much more significant. Marcus finally turned his full attention to Brad, who had started this entire interaction. The young man tried to maintain his composure, but something about Marcus's presence made him feel like a child called before the principal. Did she heal the defensive? And then there's Brad Hartwell Jr., Marcus said, his voice carrying a note of particular disappointment. Son of a man who built a successful company through hard work and treating people fairly. Nephew of 3 uncles who served in World War II, Korea, and Vietnam. Grandson of a man who earned a Purple Heart at Normandy.
Brad's jaw dropped.
How could you possibly know that? Because your grandfather's picture is on the wall in your father's office, Marcus replied.
right next to his Purple Heart and his unit citation.
I've done maintenance work in every office in this building, Brad. I've seen the photos, the awards, the family histories that people display when they're proud of their heritage.
Marcus stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the room.
Your grandfather stormed a beach in France knowing he might die.
Your uncles volunteered to serve their country when they could have stayed home. Your father built his business on principles of honor and hard work. And you use your family name to mock people who chose to serve others. The weight of those words settled on Brad like a physical burden. Around him, his friends had gone silent, each lost in their own shame and self-reflection. The easy camaraderie that had carried them through their lunch-hour cruelty had evaporated, replaced by an uncomfortable awareness of what they had become.
You want to know what real strength looks like?
Marcus asked, addressing all 5 of them now.
It looks like getting up every morning and choosing to serve something bigger than yourself. It looks like taking care of the people around you even when they can't take care of themselves.
It looks like treating every person with dignity, regardless of their job title or their circumstances.
He gestured around the cafeteria, where dozens of people were watching in rapt attention.
Everyone in this room has a story. The woman serving food behind the counter? She's working 2 jobs to put her daughter through college.
The security guard by the door? He's a former police officer who was injured in the line of duty and had to take a lower-paying job to support his family.
The guy cleaning tables next to me? He's a former teacher who lost his job due to budget cuts and is trying to rebuild his life. Marcus paused, letting his words sink in before continuing. But you 5 see only what you want to see. You see people to mock, people to feel superior to, people whose struggles make you feel better about your own comfortable lives. You've forgotten that every person deserves respect simply because they're human.
Tony, still holding his phone but no longer recording, found his voice. We didn't know. You didn't want to know. Marcus corrected firmly but not unkindly.
There's a difference. You chose to see me as entertainment rather than as a person with a history, with experiences, with feelings. You chose to assume rather than to understand. The silence that followed was profound and uncomfortable. 5 successful young men found themselves faced with a mirror that reflected back something they didn't recognize and definitely didn't like. But Marcus wasn't finished with his lesson. Marcus surveyed the 5 men before him, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. The initial shock of his revelations had settled into the room like dust after an explosion, leaving everyone to assess the damage and figure out what came next.
I want to tell you a story, Marcus said, his voice taking on a different quality. Not the sharp authority of moments before, but something warmer, more personal.
It's about a young Marine named Tommy Castellano.
20 years old, from a small town in Ohio. Tommy was the kind of kid who volunteered for everything. Extra duty, dangerous patrols, the missions nobody else wanted. The cafeteria remained absolutely silent. Even the kitchen staff had stopped their work entirely to listen. Tommy had this habit, Marcus continued, of carrying candy in his pockets during patrols. Not for himself, for the local kids we'd encounter. He'd learned a few words in Darien Pashto, and he'd kneel down and hand out Jolly Ranchers to children who hadn't seen candy in months. Marcus's eyes grew distant, clearly seeing something beyond the corporate cafeteria walls. One day, we were moving through a village that had been hit hard by fighting. Most of the buildings were damaged, families displaced. Tommy saw a little girl, maybe 6 years old, sitting alone next to what used to be her house. She was crying, and Tommy immediately went over to her. Brad found himself leaning forward despite himself, drawn into the story. Tommy knelt down and offered her a piece of candy, like he always did, but this little girl looked at him and said something in broken English that stopped all of us cold. She said, "My daddy says Americans are bad men who hurt people." She was scared of us, but she was also hungry and alone. Marcus paused, letting the image settle in everyone's minds. Tommy could have walked away. We had orders to keep moving, places to be, mission to complete. But instead, he sat down right there in the dirt next to that little girl. He pulled out his MRE, his meal for the day, and shared it with her. He didn't speak her language well, but he drew pictures in the sand to make her laugh. The emotion in Marcus's voice was becoming more apparent now. For 20 minutes, Tommy sat with that scared little girl, sharing his food, making her smile, showing her that not all Americans were the monsters someone had told her about.
When we finally had to move out, she hugged his leg and waved goodbye.
Steve, who had earlier mocked Marcus's movements, felt tears forming in his eyes. What happened to him? Marcus's expression grew heavier.
3 days later, Tommy stepped on an IED while trying to reach wounded civilians caught in crossfire.
He died instantly. He was 3 weeks away from going home to his parents and his girlfriend who was planning their wedding. The weight of the story settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Several people in the cafeteria were openly crying now, including some of the men at other tables who had been listening to the entire exchange.
Tommy's parents came to the memorial service, Marcus continued. They asked me what their son was like as a soldier.
They wanted to know if he'd made a difference, if his sacrifice meant something. Marcus looked directly at Brad. I told them about the candy, about the children he helped, about the village he died trying to protect. I told them their son understood something that a lot of people never learn. That real strength isn't about power over others. It's about using whatever power you have to lift others up. David, whose father's Vietnam service had been revealed earlier, spoke quietly. He sounds like an incredible person. He was, Marcus agreed. But here's the thing. Tommy wasn't special because he was extraordinary. He was special because he chose to be decent. Every day, in small ways, he chose kindness over convenience. He chose service over self-interest. He chose to see the humanity in everyone he met. Marcus gestured around the cafeteria again. Every person in this room has that same choice, every single day. You can choose to see the humanity in the people around you, or you can choose to see them as entertainment, as obstacles, as less important than yourself. Tony finally found his voice. We chose wrong today.
Yes, you did, Marcus agreed without hesitation, but the beautiful thing about being human is that you get to choose again tomorrow.
And the next day, and every day after that, Mark shifted uncomfortably in his seat. But what we did, the filming, the mocking, that's not who we really are.
Marcus studied Mark for a long moment.
Isn't it? He asked quietly. Because from where I'm standing, what I saw today looked pretty real, pretty intentional, pretty consistent with people who've done this kind of thing before. The accuracy of that observation hit all 5 men like a physical blow. They had done this before. Maybe not exactly like this, but they'd found entertainment in others' discomfort, laughed at people they considered beneath them, used their privilege as a weapon against those who couldn't fight back.
But that doesn't mean it has to define you, Marcus continued. Tommy made mistakes too.
We all do. The question is what you do next, how you choose to grow from this moment. Brad, who had been silent for several minutes, finally spoke. What would you want us to do? Marcus considered the question carefully. I want you to understand something fundamental about respect. It's not something you earn based on your job title or your bank account or your family name. It's something you give to others simply because they exist, because they're human beings with their own stories, their own struggles, their own dignity. He walked over to the nearest table and picked up a napkin, holding it up for everyone to see. This napkin doesn't have any inherent value, it's just paper. But if someone needs it, if they spill something, if they need to wipe their eyes, if they're bleeding and it's all you have, suddenly it becomes precious. People are like that. They have value not because of what they can do for you, but because they exist. Steve wiped his eyes with the back of his hand. I never thought about it that way.
Most people don't, Marcus replied. We're taught to measure worth by achievement, by status, by what people can provide for us.
But real worth, human worth, isn't conditional. The man cleaning floors has the same inherent dignity as the CEO in the corner office.
David looked up suddenly. You said you've done maintenance in every office in the building.
You know everyone's stories. Marcus nodded. Most of them, anyway. The lawyer on the 7th floor who works 16-hour days because her husband has cancer and the medical bills are destroying them. The accountant on the 3rd floor who takes the bus to work because he's saving every penny to bring his parents over from El Salvador.
The receptionist on the 5th floor who's studying for her nursing degree at night because she wants to help people.
Brad felt a growing sense of shame as he realized how little he knew about the people he saw every day.
We work in this building every day, and we don't know any of that. Because you've never asked, Marcus said simply. Because you've never looked beyond the surface. Because you've been so focused on your own importance that you've forgotten to see the importance in others. Tony looked at his phone, which had captured everything from the beginning of their cruel entertainment to this moment of revelation. I recorded all of this, he said quietly. The whole thing. What are you going to do with it? Marcus asked. Tony stared at the device for a long moment. I don't know. I thought I was filming something funny. Now I realize I filmed myself being the kind of person I never wanted to be.
That's growth, Marcus observed.
recognizing the gap between who you are and who you want to be.
The question is, what you do to close that gap. Mark leaned forward. How do we fix this? How do we make up for what we did? Marcus smiled for the first time since the conversation began, and it transformed his entire face.
You start by changing how you see people.
You start by recognizing that everyone, has something to teach you if you're willing to listen. You start by using your privilege and your success to lift others up instead of putting them down. He gestured toward the serving staff who had been watching the entire exchange. Maria over there has been watching you 5 eat lunch here for months. She's seen how you treat the cleaning staff, how you talk about the little people. What if, instead of ignoring her tomorrow, you asked her how her daughter's doing in college?
What if you learned her story?
Brad followed Marcus's gaze to the serving counter, where Maria was indeed watching them. For the first time, he really looked at her. Not as part of the cafeteria furniture, but as a person with her own life, her own dreams, her own challenges.
And Carlos, the security guard, Marcus continued, nodding toward the man by the entrance. Former police officer, injured in the line of duty, working here because it's what he could get. He watches over this building and everyone in it every day. When's the last time any of you thanked him for that? Steve looked over at Carlos, who met his gaze and nodded slightly. Never, Steve admitted. I've never even really seen him. That's the problem, Marcus said. You've been living in a world where only certain people matter, where only certain stories are worth hearing. But every person in this room matters. Every person has dignity. Every person deserves respect. The 5 men sat in silence for a moment, absorbing the weight of what they'd learned about themselves. Around them, the rest of the cafeteria remained quiet, everyone present seeming to understand that they were witnessing something important. Finally, Brad stood up slowly. Mr. Salas had happened. Thompson, he said formally, I owe you an apology. A real one. Marcus inclined his head slightly.
Go on.
I'm sorry, Brad said, his voice carrying throughout the quiet cafeteria. I'm sorry for mocking you, for treating you like you were less than human, for using your service and your sacrifice as entertainment. I'm sorry for being the kind of person who would do that. He paused, struggling with the words.
And I'm sorry that it took being called out publicly for me to realize how wrong I was. One by one, the others stood as well. Tony stepped forward next.
I'm sorry for filming you, for trying to make your struggle into a joke. I'm sorry for being so focused on getting likes and laughs that I forgot you were a real person with real feelings.
Steve's voice shook as he spoke. I'm sorry for mocking your disability, for making fun of something that represents your sacrifice.
I'm sorry for being cruel. David wiped his eyes. I'm sorry for repeating things about military service that I never should have said. This is the book, it's about history. I'm sorry for being cruel. David wiped his eyes. I'm sorry for dishonoring not just you but my own father's service. Mark was the last to speak. I'm sorry for thinking this was just harmless fun. I'm sorry for being the kind of person who finds entertainment in other people's pain. Marcus listened to each apology with the same steady attention he'd given everything else. When they were finished, he nodded slowly. Apologies are a start, he said. But they're just words unless they're backed up by action, by real change in how you live your lives. Brad looked around at his friends, then back at Marcus. What can we do? How do we make this right? Marcus was quiet for a long moment, considering. You want to know what would honor Tommy's memory? What would honor every person who's ever served? Every person who's ever been dismissed or mocked or treated as less than human? The 5 men nodded eagerly. Learn their names, Marcus said simply. Everyone who works in this building, everyone who serves your food, everyone who cleans your offices, everyone who makes your comfortable life possible. Learn their names and their stories, and treat them with the respect they deserve. He paused, looking each of them in the eye. And when you see someone else being cruel, being dismissive, treating another human being as entertainment, speak up. Use your privilege, your position, your voice to defend people who can't defend themselves. Tony held up his phone. What about this video? Marcus considered for a moment. That's your choice to make, but if you do share it, make sure people understand what it really shows. Not just 5 guys being jerks, but 5 guys learning to be better. Show them that change is possible, that we can all choose to do better. The conversation was interrupted by slow applause from across the cafeteria. Maria, the woman behind the serving counter, was clapping, with tears streaming down her face. Soon others joined in. Carlos, the security guard, other diners who had witnessed the entire exchange, even some of the kitchen staff who had emerged to watch. But Marcus held up his hand, stopping the applause. "Don't applaud me," he said firmly. "I didn't do anything special here. I just reminded these gentlemen of something they already knew but had forgotten, that every person deserves respect." He looked around the cafeteria, making eye contact with as many people as possible. "Every one of us has the power to choose kindness over cruelty, understanding over judgment, service over selfishness. That's not heroic, that's just human decency. And it's a choice we have to make every single day." Brad felt something shifting inside him, a fundamental reordering of his priorities and values. "Mr. Thompson," he said quietly, would you tell us more about Tommy? And about your service? I think we have a lot to learn." Marcus smiled again, and this time it reached his eyes. "I'd be honored to, son. But first, why don't you gentlemen come with me?" "There are some people in this building I'd like you to meet, starting with Maria, who's been listening to this whole conversation, and probably has some things to say about respect and dignity herself." The 5 men looked at each other, then back at Marcus. The easy arrogance that had carried them into this confrontation was gone, replaced by something much more valuable: humility, and the beginning of wisdom. As they prepared to follow Marcus toward the serving counter, Brad realized that this lunch break had changed everything.
They'd walked into the cafeteria as 5 privileged men looking for entertainment at someone else's expense.
They were walking out as 5 human beings who had been reminded of what it meant to see the humanity in others. The lesson was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the confrontation in the cafeteria, and the changes were visible throughout the building. Word had spread quickly through the corporate complex, carried not by gossip but by the transformation in behavior that people couldn't help but notice.
Brad arrived at work that morning carrying a box of donuts from the bakery down the street.
It had become his Tuesday routine, bringing treats for the maintenance staff who worked the early shift, not as charity or condescension, but as a simple gesture of appreciation for people he'd previously never noticed. He found Marcus in the supply closet on the 3rd floor, methodically organizing cleaning supplies with the same precision he brought to everything else. "Morning, Mr. Thompson," Brad said, setting the box on a nearby shelf. "Brought some of those apple fritters Carlos mentioned he liked." Marcus looked up with a smile that had become familiar over the past weeks.
"That's thoughtful of you."
"Carlos will appreciate it. He mentioned his granddaughter's birthday is this weekend, first one since she moved here from Guatemala."
"Ah, here's the same."
Brad nodded, filing the information away. He'd learned to really listen when people shared details about their lives, understanding now that these weren't just polite conversations, but windows into the rich, complex stories that surrounded him every day.
"I wanted to update you on something," Brad said. "The video Tony posted online?" Marcus raised an eyebrow.
Tony had ultimately decided to share the footage, but he'd edited it carefully and added his own narration explaining what had happened and what he'd learned. The video had gone viral, but not in the way any of them had expected.
"It's reached over 2 million views," Brad continued, "but the response has been incredible. People are sharing their own stories about veterans, about service workers, about times they realized they needed to check their privilege."
Tony's been getting messages from people all over the country saying it changed how they think about respect.
Marcus nodded thoughtfully. "And how's Tony handling all the attention?" "He's actually started a series," Brad replied, called Second Chances. He interviews people whose stories might otherwise go unheard. Veterans, service workers, people society tends to overlook, he said. "You taught him that everyone has something valuable to share, if we just listen." The transformation in Tony had been perhaps the most dramatic of the 5. The young man who had once filmed others' pain for entertainment had discovered a genuine passion for storytelling that honored rather than exploited. His social media presence had shifted completely, from shallow self-promotion to meaningful content that highlighted the dignity in ordinary people doing extraordinary things. Marcus began loading his cart with supplies for the morning rounds. "And the others?" Brad fell into step beside him as they headed toward the elevator. Over the past 3 weeks, this had become another routine, accompanying Marcus on his rounds when possible, learning about the building and its people from someone who actually paid attention to both.
"Steve's been volunteering at the VA hospital on weekends," Brad reported. "Started with just reading to patients, but now he's helping with their job training program.
Turns out he's got a real gift for helping people write resumes and practice interviews." They paused at the elevator, waiting for it to arrive.
"David's been meeting with his father every Sunday," Brad continued. "They're finally talking about his dad's time in Vietnam."
His father started crying the first time David thanked him for his service. Apparently no one had ever said that to him before. The elevator doors opened, revealing Mark inside, holding a coffee carrier with 6 cups.
He'd taken to bringing coffee for the security guards who worked the different shifts, learning their preferences and their stories over numerous conversations.
Morning, Mr. Thompson, Brad, Mark said as they entered. The Colombian roast for Carlos, and that hazelnut blend for Janet on the afternoon shift. Marcus accepted his own coffee with a nod of thanks.
How's Janet's son doing?
The one studying engineering? Mark's face lit up. He got accepted to the scholarship program we told him about. Full tuition to the state university. Janet was crying when she told me yesterday.
The scholarship program was one of several initiatives that had emerged from the Five Men's Changed Perspective. Working with the building management and various tenant companies, they'd established a fund to help children of service workers pursue higher education.
It wasn't charity in the traditional sense. It was recognition that the people who made their professional lives possible deserved investment in their dreams too. They exited the elevator on the 7th floor, where Marcus began his methodical cleaning of the law offices.
Brad and Mark continued with him, something that had raised eyebrows initially but was now accepted as normal.
There's something else, Brad said as Marcus worked.
I've been talking with my father about changing some of our company policies. Marcus paused in his work. Oh, we're implementing a new program, Brad explained. Every employee, regardless of position, gets to propose one change that would improve their work experience. And management has to seriously consider every proposal, with a written response explaining our decision. Mark nodded enthusiastically. My company did something similar after I suggested it. We found out our cleaning staff had been dealing with a broken water heater in their break room for 6 months. Nobody in management even knew because no one had ever asked them about their working conditions.
These weren't grand gestures, but they represented a fundamental shift in thinking.
The 5 men had learned that real change happened not through dramatic proclamations, but through consistent daily choices to see and respond to the humanity around them. As they moved through the building, they encountered the ripple effects of that original confrontation. Conversations between employees and service staff had become more personal, more respectful. The invisible barriers that had separated people by job title were slowly dissolving. In the cafeteria, Maria greeted them with her usual warm smile. Her relationship with Brad and his friends had evolved from suspicious tolerance to genuine friendship. She'd become something of an informal ambassador between the service staff and the white-collar workers, helping bridge gaps that had existed for years. Mr. Caps it all. Brad, she said, her English still accented but much more confident than before. My daughter. She wants to thank you again for the reference letter. Brad waved off her gratitude, but he was clearly pleased. Maria's daughter had needed a character reference for her college application, and Brad had been honored to provide it after getting to know the young woman through her mother's stories. How did the interview go? He asked.
Very good, Maria beamed.
She thinks maybe she gets the scholarship for the nursing program. Marcus smiled as he watched the interaction. This was what respect looked like in practice, not just treating people decently, but actively investing in their success and well-being. Tony appeared in the cafeteria around 11, camera equipment in hand. His latest interview was with Carlos, the security guard, about his transition from police work to private security and his philosophy on protecting people. Mr. Thompson, Tony called out when he spotted them. Perfect timing. Would you mind being in the background for a few shots? Carlos was telling me about how your conversation with us inspired him to start sharing his own story. Marcus looked slightly uncomfortable with the attention, but he nodded. He'd come to understand that his role in these young men's transformation had value beyond just their own growth. The story was reaching people far beyond their building, inspiring similar conversations about respect and service in workplaces across the country. As Tony set up his equipment, David arrived for his lunch break. His relationship with his father had become the cornerstone of his own transformation. The anger and confusion that had shaped his understanding of military service had been replaced by pride and a deeper appreciation for sacrifice.
Dad's coming to the Veterans Day ceremony next month, David told Marcus.
First time he's participated in anything military-related since he came home from Vietnam. Marcus felt a familiar tightness in his throat. The healing of old wounds was always profound to witness, but there was something especially moving about a father and son reconnecting over shared understanding of service and sacrifice.
That means a lot, Marcus said simply. For both of you. The 5 men had gathered now in the cafeteria, a scene that would have been unimaginable just weeks before. Where once they had sat in isolation, viewing everyone around them as background characters in their own important lives, they now participated in the rich community that had always existed in the building. Steve arrived last, slightly out of breath from rushing over from the VA hospital where he'd been helping with a job fair for veterans transitioning to civilian careers. Sorry I'm late, he said, taking a seat at their usual table.
We had 3 veterans get job offers today, including a guy who's been struggling for 2 years to find steady work. Brad looked around at his friends, marveling at the change in all of them.
They were still successful professionals, still ambitious and driven. But their success now felt meaningful in a way it hadn't before, connected to something larger than their own advancement.
You know what I realized? Tony said, adjusting his camera for better lighting on Carlos's interview. That day in the cafeteria, we thought we were the successful ones, the important ones.
But we were actually the most broke people in the building. Mark looked up from his conversation with Maria about her daughter's college plans.
Us too?
What do you mean? We were broke in the things that actually matter, Tony explained.
Broke in compassion, broke in understanding, broke in basic human decency.
All our money and status couldn't hide the fact that we were spiritually bankrupt. Steve nodded thoughtfully. Mr. Thompson didn't just teach us about respect. He taught us about wealth, real wealth, the kind that comes from lifting others up instead of putting them down.
Marcus, who had been listening quietly while organizing his cleaning supplies, looked up at the 5 young men who had become so much more than the entitled bullies he'd encountered 3 weeks ago.
You know what I see when I look at you 5 now? He asked. They waited expectantly. I see the kind of men Tommy Castellano would have been proud to serve alongside, Marcus said quietly. Men who understand that real strength comes from service, that real success comes from helping others succeed, that real leadership means making everyone around you better. The words hung in the air like a benediction, and for a moment, the bustling cafeteria faded away. 5 young men sat with the quiet understanding that they had been given something precious, a second chance to become the people they were meant to be.
But the lesson wasn't over yet. The hardest part still lay ahead. 6 months after the confrontation that changed everything, Marcus Thompson received a phone call that would test everything the 5 young men had learned about respect, service, and the true meaning of strength. It was a Thursday morning when his supervisor, Janet Morris, found him in the supply room with tears streaming down his face.
She'd worked with Marcus long enough to know that he wasn't a man who cried easily, and the sight of him staring at his phone with such raw emotion immediately concerned her.
Marcus, what's wrong? She asked gently.
Marcus looked up, struggling to find his voice. That was the VA hospital, he managed. They've been trying to reach me for hours. My buddy Jake Morrison, he's dying. Janet placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Jake Morrison was a name she'd heard many times over the months. Marcus often spoke of his fellow Marine, another veteran struggling with PTSD and the invisible wounds of war. Unlike Marcus, who had found stability in work and routine, Jake had never quite found his footing after returning home.
How long does he have? Janet asked.
Days, maybe hours, Marcus replied, wiping his eyes. He's been living on the streets for the past year. Liver failure from alcohol. He's refusing treatment. Says he's ready to go. Marcus's voice broke again. He asked for me. Said he wants to say goodbye. Janet didn't hesitate. Go. Take whatever time you need. Your job will be here when you get back. But Marcus shook his head. I can't afford to miss work. Medical bills from my own treatments. Rent. He trailed off, the weight of practical reality crushing against his desire to be with his dying friend. Word of Marcus's situation spread quickly through the building. Carried not by gossip, but by the network of genuine relationships he'd helped foster over the past months. By noon, Brad had heard the news from Maria, who had heard it from Carlos, who had witnessed Marcus's emotional phone call. The 5 men gathered in the conference room that had become their regular meeting space for planning their various charitable initiatives. But this wasn't about their projects. This was about their friend, their teacher, the man who had shown them what real character looked like. We have to help him, Brad said immediately. Whatever he needs to go see his friend, we make it happen. Tony was already pulling out his phone. I'll book him a flight, first class, whatever gets him there fastest. And a hotel, Steve added. Somewhere nice, not some cheap place. He shouldn't have to worry about money while he's dealing with this. David leaned forward. What about the time off? He said he couldn't afford to miss work. Mark, who had become increasingly involved in the building's management decisions through his relationship with the property company, spoke up.
I'll talk to building management.
We'll make sure he gets paid leave for as long as he needs. But as they planned their response, Brad felt a growing unease. Over the months, they'd learned to think more deeply about their actions, to consider not just their intentions but their impact. Wait, he said, holding up his hand. Are we doing this right? The others looked at him in confusion. I mean, our hearts are in the right place, Brad continued. But are we solving this the right way? Are we treating Marcus as an equal, asking what he needs? Or are we doing what we think is best and imposing it on him,
The question hung in the air, heavy with the lessons they'd learned about respect and dignity. They'd been reminded repeatedly that good intentions didn't always translate to appropriate actions.
Tony put his phone down slowly. You're right. We should ask him what he wants, not just assume we know what's best. They found Marcus in the cafeteria, sitting alone at a corner table with an untouched sandwich in front of him. His normally steady hands were shaking again, but this time it wasn't from nerve damage. It was from grief and helplessness. Brad approached carefully, mindful of everything Marcus had taught them about treating people with dignity.
Mr. Hocox? Thompson, we heard about your friend. We're sorry. Marcus looked up, his eyes red-rimmed but grateful for the concern. Thank you. Jake is a good man. We served together, went through hell together. He saved my life more than once. Steve pulled up a chair, followed by the others. Can we ask what you need? Not what we think you need, but what would actually help you right now. The question clearly caught Marcus off guard. In his experience, when people offered help, they usually came with their own ideas about what that help should look like. Being asked what he actually wanted was both refreshing and overwhelming. I need to see him, Marcus said simply. He's in a VA hospital in San Antonio. Been there for 3 days, refusing visitors except for me. But the cheapest flight I can find is $400, and I can't take unpaid leave without risking my apartment.
David leaned forward. What if those obstacles weren't there? What if you could go without worrying about money or your job? Marcus studied the young man's face, seeing genuine concern rather than pity or condescension.
If I could go without consequences, I'd leave right now. Jake doesn't have long, but I owe him everything. Mark spoke carefully. What if we told you that your job is secure, that you'll be paid for whatever time you need, and that your travel expenses are covered?
Would you accept that help?
From you 5? Marcus asked, surprised. Why would you do that?
Brad felt emotion rising in his throat.
Because 6 months ago, you taught us what it means to serve others. You showed us that real strength comes from helping people who can't help themselves. You gave us a second chance to be better men. He paused, gathering himself. Let us give something back, not as charity, but as friends helping a friend. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, processing the offer and the relationship it represented. These 5 men, who had started as strangers and briefly been adversaries, had somehow become family.
There's something else, Tony said quietly.
If Jake is willing, and if you think it would be appropriate, I'd like to come with you, not to film, not for content, but to meet the man who served alongside someone who changed our lives. Steve nodded. We all would, if that would help. Not to intrude, but to honor both of you. Marcus felt tears forming again, but these were different tears. Tears of gratitude rather than grief.
True. Likewise.
He'd like that, he said finally. Jake always said the best thing about the Marines wasn't the Corps itself, but the brotherhood that lasted long after the uniform came off. Within 2 hours, arrangements had been made. The building management, influenced by months of the 5 men's advocacy for employee welfare, approved immediate paid leave. A charter flight was booked, not first class on a commercial airline, but a small private jet that would get Marcus to San Antonio in half the time. But the most significant gesture came from an unexpected source. Word of Marcus's situation had spread throughout the building, and by late afternoon, Carlos approached their table in the cafeteria. Mr. Marcus, the security guard said formally, I want to come with you to San Antonio.
Marcus looked up in surprise.
Carlos, that's incredibly kind, but you don't need to.
Yes, I do, Carlos interrupted gently. You see, I know about Jake Morrison.
The statement shocked everyone at the table. Carlos continued, My brother served with the 82nd Airborne. He came home from Iraq broken, couldn't adjust, lived on the streets for 2 years before he died of an overdose. I never got to say goodbye, never got to tell him that his service mattered, that his life mattered. Carlos's voice grew thick with emotion. I can't help my brother anymore. But maybe I can help Jake. Maybe I can be there so another veteran doesn't die alone, forgotten by the country he served.
The circle of support was growing beyond anything Marcus could have imagined.
Maria emerged from behind the serving counter, approaching their table with quiet determination.
Mr. Dad.
Marcus, she said in her careful English.
My nephew, he was a soldier too. Killed in Afghanistan 3 years ago. We never got to bring his body home. Never got to have proper funeral. She placed a small, worn photograph on the table.
A young man in military uniform smiling broadly. Take this with you.
Tell your friend Jake that Maria Rodriguez honors his service, that his sacrifice is not forgotten.
By evening, the small charter flight had become something much larger. Building employees had pooled resources to send flowers, cards, and small gifts for Jake. The Korean War veterans from the senior center next door had sent a handwritten letter. Even the elementary school children from the after-school program in the building's community room had made a card thanking Jake for his service.
As they prepared to depart the next morning, Marcus stood in the building lobby surrounded by dozens of people who had once been invisible to each other.
The community that had always existed had finally found its voice, united by the example of one man's sacrifice and the transformation of 5 others. Brad handed Marcus a small wrapped package.
"This is from all of us," he said. "Not the 5 of us, everyone in the building who wanted to contribute." Marcus unwrapped it carefully, revealing a shadow box containing a folded American flag, a Purple Heart medal, and a small plaque that read, "To Jake Morrison, United States Marine Corps. Your service is honored, your sacrifice remembered, your brotherhood eternal." "We know Jake earned his own medals," Tony explained, "but we wanted him to have something that represented how grateful we are for everything he gave." Marcus couldn't speak.
The magnitude of what these people had done, the love and respect they were showing for a man they'd never met, overwhelmed him completely.
The flight to San Antonio was quiet, filled with the weight of purpose and sorrow.
Marcus, Carlos, and the 5 young men sat together, sharing stories about service, brotherhood, and the invisible wounds that followed soldiers home from war. When they arrived at the VA hospital, they found Jake Morrison exactly as Marcus had feared. Thin, gray, fading fast but alert enough to recognize his old friend.
The reunion was private at first. Just Marcus and Jake, 40 years of shared history condensing into precious final moments. But when Marcus told Jake about the people who had come to honor him, about the community that had formed around their story, Jake asked to meet them. One by one, they entered his room. Carlos with his story of loss and regret, Tony with his tale of transformation, Brad with his gratitude for lessons learned. Jake listened to each story with the attention of someone who understood that his final mission was to help heal the wounds that war had left not just on him, but on everyone it touched.
"You know what I learned in the Marines?" Jake whispered to the group gathered around his bed. "I learned that heroes aren't the guys who do extraordinary things. Heroes are ordinary guys who do ordinary things when extraordinary things are happening around them." He looked at Marcus with eyes that held both love and release. Taking care of each other, showing up when it matters, treating everyone with dignity, that's not heroic.
That's just human.
But in a world that often forgets how to be human, maybe that's the most extraordinary thing of all. Jake Morrison died peacefully that night, surrounded by brotherhood that had found him even in his darkest hour.
The funeral, held a week later, was attended by hundreds of people who had never known Jake but understood what his life represented. As they stood at the graveside, Marcus realized that Jake's death had become something none of them expected, not an ending, but a beginning. The community that had formed around their story had discovered something powerful. That service to others, respect for human dignity, and the courage to change were not abstract concepts but daily choices that could transform not just individuals but entire communities. The 5 men who had once mocked a veteran in a cafeteria now stood as pallbearers for another veteran they'd known for only hours. But the man they carried represented everything they'd learned about sacrifice, about service, and about the brotherhood that extends far beyond military service, to encompass all those who choose to lift others up. 6 months after laughter had erupted in a corporate cafeteria, tears fell at a military cemetery. But these tears watered the seeds of change that would continue growing long after the last mourner had gone home, long after the story had been told and retold, long after 5 young men had learned what it really meant to be strong.
The lesson was complete, but the living of it had just begun.